Hey everybody, my name is Trevor Spires with howtoNSX.com, and today we get a fun subject: old school vSphere networking concepts. We're going to talk about port groups, static, ephemeral, when to use them, and why you need them. Okay, so this was actually a request from a coworker of mine who said that it wasn't super clear what exactly an ephemeral port group specifically, what the need of it was, why you would ever want to have one. So that's the point of this video, is just to hopefully provide some clarity and education around those ephemeral port groups, and then I'll spend a little time talking about some of the other port groups available in your vSphere environment. I'm going to give you a quick overview of that, and then we're going to do a demo of what are the differences between these port groups to just kind of further explain why these ephemeral port groups are pretty important to your networking in vCenter. And then finally, with the last bit of the video, I'll just whiteboard some failure scenarios. Again, to even if you're not in the vSphere interface, you can at least kind of understand why and how these certain port groups play together from a recovery perspective and a resiliency perspective. So one thing I want to point out right from the very start is, when we talk about port groups, whether it's static or ephemeral or NSX, they do basically the same thing at a fundamental level, right? The point of a port group is really just to be a layer 2 segment in your VMware environment, right? So that means a VLAN, or in the case of NSX, maybe that's an overlay network. But these are VLANs in the sense that you know them, 802.1q tag VLANs. These are how those are accomplished inside of ESXi and inside of vCenter. And they're also kind of like organizational buckets for you to put virtual machines inside of, right? A VM needs to be connected to a network, and the way to do that is by connecting the NIC of that to a specific port group, right? That's how you choose what VLAN or what layer 2 segment, what services are available to a particular virtual machine or container or whatever it be in your environment, right? So there are really 3 types of port groups that are worth spending any amount of time on, right? The most common port group you'll see is static, but just take note, and you'll notice as you're configuring port groups, there's also the option to do an ephemeral port group, and then if you own NSX, NSX kind of has their own flavor of port groups as well. So I'll start with static and ephemeral, right? So from the perspective of a static port group, what it means when you say that a port group has static bindings, well, that means that the port assignment is managed by vCenter. That means vCenter for that port group is the source of truth for what VMs are connected to what particular port groups and ports on your virtual switch, right? This is a good model. This is what we recommend for basically everything in your environment. Unless you need advanced services from NSX, you should be putting it on a static port group. There are performance benefits. There are just ease of management benefits that the static port group really should be your go-to for basic VLAN networking in vSphere, right? The only downside at all, I can really think of 2 downsides to a static port group. One is that it doesn't have NSX features, right? But really the big one you want to take note of here is that you have potential with a static port group to create what I would call like a chicken or egg scenario, right? What comes first, the chicken or the egg? Well, if we're talking about distributed switching and port groups, the question is, what comes first, the vCenter or the virtual distributed switch, right? Remember I mentioned these port groups are managed by vCenter. So if you connect vCenter to a port group that is managed by vCenter, then you put yourself in a scenario where if vCenter were to fail for some reason, then you're kind of locked out of making any changes or updates to that port group, right? And even worse, you can put yourself in a scenario where if all you have available is are static port groups in your environment, it can be really challenging to do a restore of your vCenter, right? So it's just something to be aware of. It's not something you'll probably run into, but it's something I've run into as an integrator and in professional services. As I've made some kind of intrusive changes to vCenter, sometimes you need to do a recovery, And if you only have static port groups, that becomes much more challenging. That's where an ephemeral port group really comes in handy, right? So an ephemeral port group is a port group where it is not managed by vCenter, right? To say the port assignment is managed by ESX, I guess you could look at it that way, right? Really what it is that with an ephemeral port group, you could manage that port group from vCenter, or you could also manage it from an ESXi host directly, which is why it's really important to have at least one for a recovery scenario. Because again, if we imagine a scenario where vCenter's down and we need to do a restore, well, if you have just one backup port group, a recovery port group that's ephemeral, then there's no problem. You could just add vCenter to one of those port groups because you can manage it at the host level, right? So upon restore, when you run the vCenter installation wizard that you download from the VMware website, you just point that at a host, and you can select one of the ephemeral port groups to be where you make that vCenter land, right? And again, that's important because if you had only static port groups and your vCenter's down, you can't add new VMs until vCenter comes back up. So really, that's really the only time I recommend anybody uses an ephemeral port group is for vCenter recovery, right? But because it's so critical, right? Because vCenter recovery, you want to have that ability to cleanly and quickly recover vCenter, you need to have at least one ephemeral port group in your environment, right? And that ephemeral port group, by the way, if you're using VLANs, you're gonna want it to be tagged with the same VLAN as your vCenter's port group usually is, right? So what it really looks like is, let's say my vCenter is on VLAN 5. Well, I'll have it on a static port group, right, by default, and I'll put everything in VLAN 5 on that static port group. But you should also have a backup, a recovery port group that's also on VLAN 5 that's configured as ephemeral. That way, if you need to do the restore, you can do it, and vSphere is none the wiser. It just knows it's on VLAN 5, so it can reach all the resources that it needs, right? And then once the restore is done, you can move vCenter back to the static. But again, the ephemeral is really, really important for that recovery, right? Finally, really the only other option within large scale type of port group management and networking management in vSphere would be an NSX port group, right? So an NSX port group is kind of its own thing. It's neither static or ephemeral. If you look in the GUI, it'll show up as ephemeral, but it's different because this is a port group that's managed outside of vSphere. It's managed by NSX itself, right? That's really good because now from a recoverability perspective, you have all the resilience of NSX, which has this highly available 3-node architecture. So it's very rare to see all 3 nodes go down. So you would maintain manageability of these port groups under most scenarios. And what's really cool about and unique about the NSX port groups is that they can be managed through NSX. They can also be consumed through vCenter and through ESX, right? So that means, again, from a restore perspective, if I ever needed to restore vCenter, I could very easily restore it to an NSX port group, even if vCenter is completely offline, okay? So these are really, the point of an NSX port group is to give you advanced networking and security features, right? So that is microsegmentation, distributed firewalling, distributed IDS, overlay networking for like automation use cases, some DR use cases, active-active designs. There's a lot of really cool stuff we can do with these NSX port groups that go way above and beyond just basic 802.1q VLAN tags, right? So for me, these are my personal go-to, right? I'm a networking and security specialist by trade, so I basically always do everything networking in NSX. Just because I'm a power user for networking. I need those advanced features, okay? That's it for the slides, all right? And then now we get to the fun part. I'm going to actually show you on one of my VMs why these ephemeral port groups are so important. So I'm going to swap over to my lab, and here's what I want to show you. All I want you to take note of here is that I've got this ephemeral port group, right? And I even gave it a name, recovery, do not delete. It has 0 virtual machines connected to it right now because it wouldn't have anything connected. It's really just there for recovery. And then I have a static port group. This is where all my stuff in that VLAN is actually living, right? So I'm going to use the example of my Windows 10 VM. I just have a random Windows 10 VM. It's connected, as you can see right here, to that static port group. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to kind of show you how at the host level, right, how differently the ephemeral port group from the static port groups behave. And it's important to look at it at the host level because that's where you would be logging in if vCenter were ever to go offline and you needed to do a restore procedure. You'd be logging into the ESXi host directly. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. So I'm in my ESX host, and I'm going to go ahead and select my Windows 10 virtual machine and do an edit settings. So right now I'm on my static port group. Because I'm logged into ESX, there's no problem for me to move this to an ephemeral port group from the ESX console. So I'll just pop, boom, let's put this thing on an ephemeral port group, save, and bada bing, bada boom, it's on the ephemeral port group, right? That's really not a big deal. That's kind of what's cool about ephemeral port groups is that they can be managed from ESX or from vCenter, right? But if I didn't have that ephemeral port group and I needed to do a recovery of a vCenter or some other network control component, it could be a challenge, right, if I don't have the ephemeral. Because, watch this. If I were to go to this VM and I were to try to now move it back to a static port group, what's going to happen? I'm going to get an error, right? And again, this is because static port group bindings are controlled by vCenter. So you cannot add VMs to static distributed port groups from ESX, right? And that's why you need to have an ephemeral for recovery, right? Because imagine a scenario where my vCenter is up right now, but if this vCenter crashed, everything continues to run, right? No, there's no problems, but I need to get my vCenter back to manage my environment, and the only way to do that, again, is going to be through an ephemeral port group or a standard port group, right? And there are other ways to recover it. So like if you're in a scenario where your vCenter's down, you need to restore, and you didn't create that ephemeral port group, there are still ways to do it. You can go into the CLI and you can do a manual recovery, but far and away, an ephemeral port group is the easiest way to do it, and all it takes is 5 seconds to make it, and it can save you a lot of headache if you ever do indeed need to do a restore of your vCenter. Okay, so now I'll show you, just to kind of show like the static port groups can only be managed by vCenter. What I'll do is I'll just go back, change the networking, and now I'm going to move it back to this VM back to its original static port group. And I got the error in ESXi when I tried to do that. You're going to see vCenter has no problem with it. And now it's back on the static port group, right? And again, now I didn't get the error because I'm doing it from vCenter, because the static port groups are vCenter managed. All right. So I want to take us back to my networking tab here in my environment. And so, like I mentioned, I've got this static port group. I've got this ephemeral port group. There's one more type of port group that's kind of worth mentioning. That's NSX, right? Those are these distributed port groups that are noted with this little N. You can see they're actually showing up as ephemeral in the switch, but really, I mean, they probably are technically ephemeral under the hood, but these are not managed by vCenter. These are completely managed by NSX. In fact, I can show you within NSX how those are created. So if I go to networking in NSX and then I go to segments, you'll see here is where I would create a NSX port group. So an NSX segment or network that would show up in vCenter for me to consume. And what's cool about these networks is that it's not just layer 2 VLANing, right? I can connect these to virtual routers. I can connect these to virtual load balancers, VPN. I can do NAT. And really one of the biggest things that our customers enjoy out of these port groups from a feature perspective is that we can do layer 4 through layer 7 in firewalling, and we can do deep packet inspection for IDS at the host level. Really efficient, right? Near line rate type of firewalling is available in this sort of setup because we're taking advantage of sitting inside the hypervisor. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because this isn't the point of the session, but I just want you to be aware that that's kind of the third type of port group that you may see out there in the wild. So I've showed you this. I've showed you the ephemeral. The only other thing I want to quickly show you is, like, let's say you're watching this and you're like, okay, well, this sounds good. I get it. I need an ephemeral port group. How do I make one? Here's how you do it. It's really simple. All you do is go to your virtual distributed switch. You would say, I want a new distributed port group. And then I'll say DPG01E for ephemeral. And all you do is at the port binding here, you just select ephemeral, right? And again, you wouldn't do this normally, but you would want that for your recovery port group in the event you ever needed to bring vCenter back online. So that's how you would actually do it. And that's why I recommend all my customers create at least one, because it really is that simple. You just say, hey, I'm ephemeral, and then you give it the associated VLAN tag that you would need for your vCenter in the event of recovery scenario. Okay. So that's all I wanted to show you in the GUI, right? It's not complicated stuff, but if you're watching this and you're like, oh man, this is kind of confusing, you might want to go back and get some kind of basic knowledge on this distributed switch and how that works. But overall, it's fairly simple stuff. Okay. What I'd like to do now is actually just whiteboard out some of these failure scenarios that I've been talking to you about here. So what I'd like to do is just kind of imagine that these three boxes here are three different ESXi hosts. And we can also imagine that they have a virtual distributed switch kind of striped across all of them. So we could say distributed vSwitch. And this is a static port group. All right. We can also kind of assume this distributed switch has a couple of uplinks that are, maybe each ESX host has an uplink into this data center fabric, or otherwise known as a top of rack switch. I say data center fabric, it doesn't really have to be anything fancy. Any layer 2 switch will do, right? So to kind of highlight the importance of the ephemeral port group, imagine that you had a vCenter server, right? And let's say it's not in vCenter HA mode. By the way, you should have it in vCenter HA mode if you're licensed for it, which you probably are, so you should probably turn that on very soon. It's a very good idea to have that turned on. But let's say it's not in HA mode. Let's say that you're just running a single vCenter, not highly available. Well, what happens if this vCenter is the one who owns this distributed switch and it fails, right? Let's say that you have a vCenter outage. Somebody's inside of vCenter making changes, or maybe it's an old vCenter that you've migrated from Windows and it's failed during the migration. Whatever your reason is, right now vCenter's down and you need to restore vCenter from backup, right? Well, restoring vCenter from backup is not that hard. We make it actually really, really easy. It's just a GUI. You download a little app from the VMware website. You launch it, and then it's just a kind of a wizard. But the issue, though, is that if you were to do that right now with only a static port group available, you actually would not be able to restore the vCenter. You would have to log into an ESX host via the CLI, make some changes in order to do some manual steps to do that restore, right? And by the way, this is assuming that all you have is a virtual switch in your environment. There's no standard switches for management or anything like that, right? Well, what you need to do in this scenario is watch this video, and then because you watched it, you would have made an ephemeral port group, right? And now they have an ephemeral port group, you're all set, because when you go through that restore wizard on your vCenter, all you have to do is pick the ephemeral port group to be the port group that you want to connect it to, and everything's going to work fine. Your vCenter will get back online. You can take control of all your networking and your hosts again, and all is right in the world, right? But if you didn't have that ephemeral port group that you made before vCenter crashed, you could be in a tough spot from a recovery perspective. So you always want to have one ephemeral port group. And by the way, you're going to want that ephemeral port group to be a member of the same VLAN, right? The same VLAN that that static port group that vCenter was on originally was hosted on, right? Now, once vCenter is back up and running, I would actually not recommend you keep it on the ephemeral port group. I would go ahead and say, yeah, switch it back to the static port group. That's cool, right? We'll leave it there because it doesn't have as many caveats as the ephemeral. So that's what happens if vCenter manages your networking. That's why the ephemeral is important to recovery. But what about if NSX manages your networking? What does that recovery scenario and failure scenario look like? Well, I'll go ahead and draw out another vCenter again, right? And then I'll say we've got 3 NSX managers, right? Which, by the way, is the only supported architecture for NSX, is to have 3 node clusters for your manager. You can have multiple clusters of 3, but they must be clusters of 3. That is a requirement for support for NSX. Okay, so let's now walk through the failure scenario here and what that would look like, right? And well, let's say that this is not a static port group now, this blue one. Let's actually say that this is an NSX port group. So this is a port group managed and owned by NSX, and your vCenter, your NSX managers all live on this port group, right? Well, okay, let's talk through failures, right? Let's say we lose NSX manager 1. What happens? Nothing, right? It's a 3-node cluster, so everything's hunky-dory. We can lose that manager. Really nothing matters here. Nothing is bad. We just need to restore the manager when we have a sec, right? Let's say we lose 2 managers. Now you're still okay, actually, right? I've lost 2 managers, but I'm still fine because I've got my 3rd manager up and running. I can still make changes. I can still do anything I need, right? So let's go like full doomsday prepper here. Let's say that we lost our 3rd NSX manager and we lost our vCenter too. What then? Right? What if we need to do some kind of restore procedure or we need to make changes to our networks? Well, don't worry, right? Because you're really smart. You watched this video. You probably already have, you know what I'm going to say? An ephemeral port group, right? Again, tagged with the same VLAN that your port group that your NSX managers were on or that your vCenter was on. If you have that backup port group, the recovery is not going to be a challenge, right? That's really all these, in my mind, are good for. They're great because they allow you to recover even when you lose your entire management plane for whatever reason, right? So it's just a matter of resiliency, right? It's a matter of, in the worst case scenario, how do I restore my environment? And you should be asking yourself those kind of questions. If you, I mean, at least if you're hosting a robust environment that has important applications, you need to understand how you would get everything back online in a worst case scenario event. So, I hope that the whiteboard has been helpful. Thank you everybody for sticking with me and watching the video. I appreciate your viewership. If you'd like to see more, you can actually go to howtoNSX.com. You'll see more of my videos and blogs there. But you can also reach out to me directly. My name is Trevor Spires. You can reach me via email if you know my email, but also LinkedIn would probably be an easy way to reach me. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if there's another video you'd like to see, if there's anything else in terms of vSphere networking or any of our networking products that VMware sells, reach out to me if you have any requests, and we'll see what we can do for you. Okay, so thanks again for watching. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you learned something, and stay safe out there. All right, bye.